The Khazars were a medieval Turkic kingdom located in the Caucasus and the steppe, whose rulers reportedly converted to Judaism in the 8th or 9th century. Centuries later, some have speculated that after Khazaria fell, these Jewish Khazars migrated into Eastern Europe and helped form the Ashkenazi community. This isn't a brand new story. Scholars have noted that linking Eastern European Jews to the Khazars has been around for roughly 2 centuries. In 1883, the French scholar Ernst Renan publicly suggested that Khazar conversion could help explain the large Jewish communities along the Danube and southern Russia. Over the late 1800s and early 1900s, various thinkers on different sides of the spectrum revisited the idea, but it generally remained a side theory rather than accepted history. The Khazar story re-entered popular culture in the 20th century, most notably with Arthur Koestler's 1976 book, The 13th Tribe. Koestler, a novelist, argued that Eastern Europe's Jews couldn't have become so numerous without Khazar ancestors. He even hoped this claim would weaken anti-Semitism by suggesting that Jews weren't a single Semitic race. Ironically, others took Koestler's idea and used it for very different agendas. More recently, a few French writers and even some genetic studies have revived versions of the Khazar argument in online debates and pop culture. So why does this question keep resurfacing? And why does it matter? If we look at it closely, at the bottom of it, it's about identity and politics. For some critics of Israel or Jewish nationalism, the Khazar hypothesis is a handy way to argue that modern Jews have no roots in the biblical Middle East. In the same vein, anti-Semitic ideologues point to it in order to deny a Jewish ancestral link to the Israelites. Most scholars today, however, regard the Khazar theory as a largely discredited idea, often calling it the Khazar myth. To see where the Khazar Ashkenazi idea came from, we first have to travel back a millennium. In medieval Eurasia, there really was a Khazar Empire. It was a powerful kingdom in the northern Caucasus between the Black and Caspian Seas, which became famous for an unusual episode. According to medieval Jewish and Muslim sources, around the 8th or 9th century, the Khazar king, often named Bulan, and some of his court decided to embrace Judaism. A lively legend was recorded in what we call the Khazar correspondence. It is a set of letters between a Khazar king and Jewish scholars in Spain. It was followed by its echoes in Jewish writings like Judah Halevi's Kuzari and Abraham ibn Daud's Histories. These old accounts describe a dramatic debate, ambassadors of Christianity and Islam argued with a rabbi, and the king ultimately chose Judaism as the best faith. To be specific, those medieval stories talk about the king and his nobles converting to Judaism, not the entire population of his kingdom. The evidence from that era is thin. We don't have census records or family trees. There are a few inscriptions and coins that hint at Jewish practices, and travelers like Benjamin of Tudela mention Jewish communities among the Khazars. But most historians agree that if the Khazar rulers turned Jewish, the ordinary people may have been mixed or stayed with other religions. Fast forward to the 1800s in Europe. Suddenly, a lot of scholars, both Jewish and non-Jewish, started asking questions like, where did the Eastern European Jews come from? By then, huge Jewish populations were living in places like Poland, Russia, and Hungary, speaking Yiddish or local languages. Their numbers and culture were hard to explain just by migration from medieval France or Germany. And so this was the situation that made the old Khazar story a tempting explanation. It began to circulate that maybe many Ashkenazi Jews were descended from those Khazar converts. In 1828, a Ukrainian Jewish thinker, Isaac Levinson, even noted that local Jews said their grandparents spoke only Russian, not Hebrew or German, hinting at a different origin. Around the same time, some historians and anthropologists suggested that waves of Khazars could have fled after their empire collapsed around the 960s CE and mixed into new Jewish communities. In the 1860s and 1870s, you see fringe genealogists and even European Orientalists proposing that many Eastern European Jews might really trace back to Khazaria. They argued that a mass conversion or migration from Khazaria could explain why millions of Jews lived in those regions. But it's important to remember the context. These ideas were often driven by nationalistic thinking. In the 19th century, many nations were just defining themselves by language, territory, and ancestry. Some scholars applied similar ideas to Jews. Was Judaism a single race from ancient Israel, or a patchwork of peoples who had joined the fold over time? Those who doubted a pure Semitic origin found the Khazar legend appealing as a rationale. A few liberal Jewish thinkers even said, surely it can't be only ancient Israelites, surely other groups joined our people. So in some groups, both among Jews trying to fit into European society and among people who doubted Jewish identity, the Khazar story grew into a big explanation for where European Jews came from. But not everyone bought it. Even then, many historians and Jewish scholars were skeptical. By the 1890s, studies of Jewish cemeteries, physical anthropology, and linguistics were beginning to challenge a simple Khazar origin idea. The evidence from the Middle Ages was recognized as thin, and some pointed out that medieval Muslim and Christian authors saw Khazars as mostly pagan or Muslim. The Khazar hypothesis was still floating around though, because it fits certain narratives better than the gaps in our knowledge of early Eastern Europe. The Khazar connection really burst into popular awareness in the 1970s with Arthur Koestler's book, The 13th Tribe. Koestler, a well-known writer, argued that the Khazars must have provided the core of today's Ashkenazi Jews. He framed it as almost a proof that there is no single Jewish race, that Jews were as much a creation of conversion and migration as any other nation. On the one hand, Koestler meant it to counter old anti-Semitic ideas of a mystical Jewish race, but on the other hand, it unleashed a storm of its own. As soon as 13th Tribe hit bookshelves, it was seized on by everyone from curious lay readers to outright conspiracy theorists. For some, it was an exciting lost history. For others, it was fuel for agendas. And indeed, the 20th century saw the Khazar theme used by very different kinds of groups. In the Soviet Union, official historiography under Stalin went in a bizarre direction. State-backed scholars, influenced by paranoia and anti-Semitism, said the Khazars had been a secret Jewish empire dominating Russia before it. An anonymous Stalinist Pravda article in 1951 declared it shameful that Jews could have ruled a vast empire before Russia's rise. The Kremlin soon made that line the party line. Soviet textbooks from then on often described the Khazars as having been parasitic rulers, and Soviet archaeologists were banned from studying Khazar sites. This was state propaganda meant to portray Jews as foreign interlopers in Russian history. Across the world in Europe and America, fringe ideologues also latched on. Some Nazi and neo-Nazi writers in mid-century paid attention to the Khazar story, though usually to twist it into a bigger fantasy, like seeing the Khazars as runaways from a Nordic race or whatever. And on the opposite spectrum, a few Jewish or liberal thinkers mentioned it when discussing the origins of Zionism, immigration, or racial ideas. After 1976, as Koestler's book was translated and discussed, more readers knew the legend. In the Arab world, a number of intellectuals and politicians began to bring it up, often as a political point. If Ashkenazi Jews really came from Khazars, then modern Israelis are not native Semites and have no ancestral claim to the Holy Land. We've seen high-profile examples of that in recent years, such as statements by Palestinian leaders or Syrian officials, but it's really part of a pattern stretching back to the mid-20th century. Throughout the Arab and Muslim worlds, dozens of books and articles still circulate claiming that European Jews originated with Khazar refugees. Again, the intention is usually political. It's used to question the Israel narrative of Jews returning to an ancestral homeland. So by the late 1900s, the Khazar hypothesis was far from a random, fringe speculation. It had become a regular player in cultural and political fights over Jewish identity. White supremacists, conspiracy theorists, and even some New Age or cult writers adopted it. At the same time, occasional academics or journalists reignited public debate by re-examining old sources or using new data. Every time the question of Jewish roots makes headlines, whether through genetic studies or new historical finds, the Khazar idea tends to resurface in conversations, even if briefly. The bottom line is that the Khazar story keeps coming back because it serves as a potent symbol in various culture wars. Even today, amid all the scientific studies of ancestry, the question,
are Ashkenazim really Khazars, continues to excite debate. Newspapers and internet forums inevitably turn it out whenever a new bloodline story hits. And because history often overlaps with politics, these discussions are rarely just academic. Medieval Jewish life in Europe split broadly into two streams. In the West and Central Europe, small Jewish settlements re-emerged after the fall of Rome. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Jews from Mediterranean lands began moving north through France into the Rhineland, the Middle Rhine Valley in today's Germany. In places like Mainz, Worms, and Speyer, Jewish merchants and scholars founded communities under the Carolingian and later German kings. These new Ashkenazi settlements grew because rulers often welcomed Jewish traders and moneylenders. By the 11th and 12th centuries, well-organized Jewish congregations are clearly attested in cities along the Rhine and into France. Historians like Michael Tock and Robert Chazan describe this process as a northward migration from older Jewish centers. As these Western communities took root, a distinct Ashkenazi culture began to form. The Jews of the 11th to 13th century France and Germany developed their own schools of rabbinic learning. Leading figures such as Rabbi Gershom of Mainz and Rashi of Troy shaped Ashkenazi ritual and law. Over the next few centuries, this Western Ashkenazi core expanded eastward. After the upheavals of the Crusades around 1096, when many Rhineland Jews were attacked, large numbers of Jews emigrated to Central and Eastern Europe. Historians note that the first large movement of Jews from Western Europe into Poland happened around the time of the First Crusade in 1096. In these new lands, Polish, Hungarian, and Lithuanian rulers often encouraged settlement. For instance, Poland's 1264 Statute of Kalisz gave Jews official protection and trade rights. By the 13th and 14th centuries, flourishing Ashkenazi communities dotted Eastern Europe, speaking the same religious and cultural traditions as their German and French counterparts. When you line up the timelines, the story becomes much clearer. Ashkenazi Jewish communities in Europe appear after the Khazar Empire and continue long after it disappears. By the late 900s and early 1000s, Jewish congregations were already established in the Rhineland and northern France. These were real, functioning communities with synagogues, scholars, and ties to other Jewish centers in Europe and the Mediterranean. By the 11th and 12th centuries, those communities had grown large and stable in German cities like Cologne and Worms. At this point, the name Ashkenaz was already being used to refer to Germany itself, showing that a distinct Ashkenazi identity had taken shape in Western Europe. Large Jewish populations only began to appear in Poland and Eastern Europe later, mainly in the 13th century as Jews migrated eastward from German-speaking lands. This movement happened gradually, over generations, not suddenly. Meanwhile, the Khazar Empire lost its political power by the middle of the 10th century and faded from history by the 11th century. By the time Ashkenazi life truly flourished in Eastern Europe, Khazaria had been gone for centuries. So the timelines don't match. Jewish settlement in Western and Central Europe was already underway before Khazaria fell. And when Jews later established large communities in Poland and Lithuania, the Khazar state no longer existed. So Ashkenazi Jewry developed as part of medieval European history, not as the result of a migration from a fallen Khazar empire.
The roots of Ashkenazi Jewish identity are much closer to Western Europe than many people realize. You can see it most clearly in their everyday language, Yiddish. Yiddish didn't appear on the steppes, and it didn't come out of Eastern Europe fully formed. It took shape around the year 1000 in the Rhineland, among Jewish communities living in German-speaking regions. At its core, Yiddish is a form of medieval German. Over time, Jews mixed that German base with Hebrew and Aramaic from religious life, and later, as they moved east, with words from Slavic languages. Linguists like Max Weinreich tell us how this happened. Jews who had earlier lived in southern France and Italy originally spoke Jewish versions of Romance languages. When they settled along the Rhine in places like Mainz and Speyer, they slowly shifted to the local German. But they didn't abandon their old vocabulary or way of speaking. They blended it. What emerged was a shared Jewish language that allowed them to live among their neighbors while still marking out a distinct communal world. And this matters because when Ashkenazi Jews later moved into Eastern Europe, often under pressure, sometimes fleeing violence, they didn't pick up a new language there. They carried Yiddish with them. That's why Yiddish spread across Poland, Lithuania, and beyond. and it's also why there's no trace of Turkic or Khazar language in Ashkenazi speech. If Ashkenazi Jews had come mainly from Khazaria, their language would show it, but it doesn't. The same pattern shows up in religion and culture. Ashkenazi prayer styles, religious poetry, and legal customs developed in medieval France and Germany. This tradition, known as Minhag Ashkenaz, is clearly different from the customs that developed in Spain or the Middle East. It reflects the world of medieval Christian Europe, not the Caucasus or Central Asia. One figure often used to illustrate this is Rabbi Gershom of Mainz, who lived around the turn of the 11th century. He led one of the most important Jewish academies of his time and set down rules that shaped Ashkenazi life for centuries. His influence spread widely. His students taught in France, and one of the most famous Jewish scholars of all time, Rashi, learned in that world and carried its traditions forward. Even everyday culture reflects this history. Food traditions, holiday customs, styles of dress, and naming patterns all line up with medieval German and French surroundings, adapted through a Jewish lens. These aren't borrowed from a Turkic empire. They're shaped by centuries of life in European towns and cities. And when we add genetics to the picture, the story stays consistent.
Over the last 20 years, Jewish genetic studies have expanded dramatically, partly because Ashkenazi Jews have well-defined founder effects, and partly because geneticists became interested in how diasporas form over time. What emerged from all these independent studies is remarkably consistent. When you compare Ashkenazi genomes to populations around the world, they consistently cluster between two poles: a strong Levantine or Middle Eastern core, a major European, mostly Southern European admixture component. This is exactly what you would expect from a Near Eastern population that entered the Mediterranean world in antiquity, lived among Greeks and Italians for centuries, and then moved into Western Europe during the Roman and early medieval periods. And here's what's not there. They do not show genetic patterns associated with Turkic or steppe populations. If Ashkenazi Jews were primarily descended from Khazars, their genomes would show at least some signature of that ancestry. Steppe populations have distinct patterns of East Eurasian markers blended with West Eurasian ones. These components are visible in populations across Central Asia, the Volga region, and even among some peoples of the North Caucasus. Ashkenazi Jews simply do not share that profile. And this isn't the conclusion of one study. It shows up whether researchers analyze mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosomes, or whole genomes. A few results even trace specific lineages. Many Ashkenazi paternal lines clearly connect back to ancient Levantine populations, while many maternal lines reflect European ancestry, meaning Jewish men migrating and marrying local European women who converted, a historically plausible scenario.
But perhaps the most decisive finding is the bottleneck. Modern Ashkenazim descend from a relatively small medieval founder population, about a few hundred to a few thousand people, who lived somewhere in Central Europe between the 9th and 12th centuries. Every large-scale genetic analysis lands in the same time frame. This population then expanded rapidly, which explains why Ashkenazi populations today share unusually high levels of genetic similarity. And this founder population existed after Khazaria had collapsed. So genetically, the main ancestor groups of Ashkenazim are earlier Jewish populations from the Levant, Southern Europeans from late antiquity, Western and Central Europeans, and later small-scale Eastern European admixture. Everything aligns with what we know from recorded history, and nothing aligns with the Khazar origin.
Genetics is only one angle. History gives us another. When you trace Jewish history from antiquity into the Middle Ages, there is no break. Communities existed in Rome, southern Italy, Provence, the Rhineland, North Africa, the Byzantine Empire, and Babylonia. These communities communicated with each other, traded with each other, and debated with each other. Their rabbis wrote responses to one another across the Mediterranean. By the time the Khazar king was converting on the steppe, European Jews already had a well-defined liturgical tradition, a network of rabbinic academies, recognizable communal leadership structures, legal norms grounded in the Talmudic academies of Babylonia and Palestine, and these traditions show continuity straight into the life of medieval Ashkenazi Jews. For example,
Rhineland Jews in the 10th to 12th centuries relied heavily on the Babylonian Talmudic tradition, not on anything from Khazaria. Their rabbis cite earlier Jewish authorities from Italy, France, and the Middle East, never Khazar scholars. Their synagogue rites, holiday customs, and legal rulings match those practiced across the Jewish world, not those of a newly converted Turkic elite. If Ashkenazi Judaism had emerged from a Khazar demographic base, we would expect at least some divergence. But the medieval record shows extraordinary consistency with the broader Jewish diaspora. When you finally step back from the Khazar debate, the legends, the gaps, the medieval speculation, something becomes clear. The actual history of Ashkenazi Jews doesn't need a lost empire to make it traumatic. It already is. The origins of Ashkenazi Jews are not the product of one royal decision on the steppes or a single dramatic migration across Eurasia. They're the product of many centuries of movement, pressure, imagination, and stubborn cultural survival. And if anything, this long, winding, richly documented story is far more interesting than any shortcut through Khazaria. Because to understand Ashkenazi history, you have to picture a community constantly on the move. They saw new economic niches opening in the Carolingian world, and they filled them. They saw emerging towns on the Rhine and in Champagne, and they built communities in them. They endured the Crusader massacres in 1096 and responded not by disappearing, but by reorganizing themselves, migrating, rebuilding, and preserving their texts and traditions under extraordinary pressure. And here's one of the most striking things about this history. Ashkenazi identity wasn't formed in peace, it was forged in resilience. This wasn't a community that experienced centuries of stability and gentle evolution. They formed new networks in some of Europe's most volatile centuries, and still, somehow, they managed to produce towering intellectual traditions, legal systems, poetry, linguistic creativity, and a recognizable communal structure that kept reappearing wherever they went. And the most fascinating part is that even with all these influences, Ashkenazi Jews maintained a continuity recognizable across over 1,000 years. Their prayers reference the same texts, their holidays follow the same rhythms, their legal rulings echo the same rabbinic voices, and their languages trace back to the same cultural crossroads. That's the real story, not a sudden emergence from a lost empire. And that brings us to the end of this story. If you found it insightful, consider subscribing for more history explained this way. Thanks for watching.